All right, so today we're going to be looking at a case that I think you'll agree is truly chilling.
Yeah.
The Crimes of Fred and Rose West.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a really fascinating source for you this time.
Okay.
A true crime podcast episode that just goes so deep into this whole investigation.
Cool.
But just a quick heads up.
Yeah.
This case delves into child abuse and murder
Right.
and sexual violence.
Of course.
So if that's not something you're ready to hear about right now,
Sure.
we totally understand.
Yeah, no, it's heavy material, and this podcast really doesn't shy away from that at all.
No, it doesn't.
One thing I found really interesting was how they use that slow burn reveal, that drip
yeah.
feed of information.
Yeah.
Keeps you hooked as a listener.
Yeah.
It starts with this seemingly ordinary house at 25 Cromwell Street.
Right, in Gloucester.
Yeah, exactly. And only gradually unveils the horrors that are hidden there.
It's like the house itself is a character.
That's
this
a bit.
facade of normalcy,
Uh-huh.
hiding something truly monstrous. And the trigger for it all, the search for Heather West,
Oh, wow.
Fred's daughter,
Right.
it's like opening Pandora's box.
It really is. It sets off this chain reaction.
Yeah.
The excavation of the garden,
Yeah.
the discoveries in the cellar,
Uh-huh.
and then we get to Fred West's confession.
But even in confessing,
Yeah.
Fred's trying to manipulate the narrative.
It seems that way, right?
Maintain a degree of control
For sure.
that comes through so clearly in the podcast
Yeah.
in how they describe his personality,
Yeah.
chatty yet evasive,
Right.
constantly spinning these elaborate lies.
And
But then he drops this chilling confession note,
oh, wow.
admitting to even more victims.
So playing a game with the investigators.
Yeah, setting them on this grim treasure hunt.
Yeah, for these hidden graves.
It's wild. What do you make of that kind of behavior?
It's a classic power play.
Yeah.
Even while facing the consequences,
Right.
he's clinging to any control he can get.
Yeah.
It's something you see pretty often in these cases. The perpetrator trying to dictate the narrative.
To shape the story.
Yeah, as everything's falling apart around him.
But the real tragedy here lies with the victims.
Absolutely.
And the podcast does a good job
yeah,
highlighting those individual stories.
it does.
It'd be so easy to just get lost
Oh, yeah.
in the sheer number,
Right.
but they bring each one to life,
Uh-huh.
like Therese Segantola,
Right.
the Swiss student hitchhiking to Ireland.
Yeah.
The podcast even mentions this detail
Oh, really?
about her having what sounded like a German accent.
Wow.
Turned out she was raised
Okay.
in a German-speaking region. It's
Interesting.
Switzerland.
Yeah.
It's a small thing,
It is.
but it makes her feel real.
Right.
Like someone you could have met
Yeah, I saw
on the street.
It's those details
Yeah.
that really stand out.
Right.
Remind us these were real people.
Yeah, with their own hopes and dreams.
Exactly. The podcast also highlights Shirley Hubbard,
Right.
teenager in care, who disappeared after a date by the river.
Uh-huh.
And they talk about her spirit, her loving relationship with her boyfriend.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is.
And then there's Lucy Partington,
Yeah.
the art student,
Yeah.
who vanished from a bus stop.
Right.
It's like each of these stories
Yeah.
on their own
Right.
is tragic enough,
Yeah.
but then you put them all together
Together.
and the weight of it is just overwhelming.
It is. The podcast doesn't shy away from how brutal it all was.
No, it doesn't.
Details about the duct tape skulls,
Yeah.
the makeshift restraints.
It's hard to hear.
It's tough, but it's important. They really underscore the violence,
Yeah.
the dehumanization.
The calculated nature of the
Yeah.
crimes. It's
Yeah.
heavy stuff for sure.
It is.
And then, of course, there's the question of Rose West.
Right.
Was she a bystander or an active participant?
That's the big question, isn't
The
it?
central question.
Hanging over everything.
This whole deep dive.
And it's where things get complicated.
Yeah.
We have Rose's denials, her insistence that she knew nothing.
About the murders.
Yeah. But then you have these witness accounts
Uh-huh.
alleging violence,
Right.
sexual sadism.
And a potential involvement in the killings.
Yeah, the podcast does a good job presenting all that.
Yeah.
But they also acknowledge how hard it is to prove her guilt.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly.
So we've got this back and forth between circumstantial evidence
Yeah.
and this lack of that clear-cut, irrefutable proof.
Uh-huh.
And then you add in the twisted dynamic of Fred and Rose's relationship.
Right.
Fred trying to shift blame.
Saying he was protecting Rose.
Yeah.
Right.
Rose in court
Uh-huh.
portraying herself as a victim.
A tangled web, for sure.
It is.
The podcast really lets you grapple with it all.
They do.
And it highlights how complicated these partnerships are.
Especially with such horrific acts.
Yeah. Were Rose's actions driven by fear?
Manipulation?
Or was there something darker
These are the questions
that keep you coming back?
that keep you thinking about this case.
Exactly.
And then we get to the aftermath.
Right.
Fred's suicide.
Which robbed the families of any real accountability.
Right. Rose's multiple life sentences.
Uh-huh.
The demolition of 25 Cromwell Street.
Yeah. Did any of that bring closure?
Closure is such a complex concept.
It really is. The podcast talks about the changes in missing persons procedures.
Right.
The changes that came about because of these discoveries.
Yeah.
But those
But
changes...
They can't erase the pain, the loss.
Just questions.
And for the West children,
trying to rebuild their lives with this hanging over them.
it's just another level of complexity.
Absolutely.
And the podcast ends by leaving us with those unanswered questions.
Yeah.
Were there more victims?
What died with Fred?
It's that chilling realization.
That monsters hide in plain sight.
Yeah.
It makes you confront the dark side of human nature.
Question your assumptions about who's capable of what.
And I think that's why true crime fascinates us.
It's a way of exploring those extremes of behavior.
Trying to understand the darkness that's out there.
Now, as we move into the second part of this deep dive,
Okay.
I want you to think about this.
Yeah.
What are your initial reactions to this case?
Okay.
What stands out to you
Right.
about the Wests and their crimes?
Gotcha.
We'll go deeper into those specifics next time.
Okay.
The victim stories and the evidence against Rose.
Looking forward to it. One of the things that really stood out to me in this podcast was how they use these specific details to bring the victims to life. You know,
That's right.
to make them feel real.
Like we were talking about with Teresa Segantola.
Exactly.
That little detail about her accent
Right.
really makes her feel more real.
It's so easy to lose sight of the individuals
Uh-huh.
when you're dealing with a case this big.
Especially with so many victims.
Yeah, but those little details,
To bring it back.
they remind us that these were real people.
With their own lives and personalities and loves and dreams.
Exactly. And the podcast also.
They don't hold back.
No, they don't.
On the disturbing detail.
Like the duct tape on Shirley Hubbard's skull.
Or the plastic tubes
Oh, yeah.
he put in her nose so she could breathe.
It's just horrific.
It makes you wonder what kind of person could do something like that.
It really does.
I mean, to kill someone is one thing,
Right.
but to go to those lengths
To inflict that much pain,
and to have that kind of control,
it speaks to a whole other level of darkness.
for sure. And it wasn't just Shirley.
No, Lucy Partington, the art student, was found with duct tape too.
On her skull.
Yeah, the podcast talks about how much she loved literature,
Uh-huh.
how excited she was to go to art school,
A normal young woman.
just starting her life.
And then poof, she's gone.
It's like each victim's story
Is a glimpse.
into this abyss.
Yeah, into the darkness that consumed anyone.
Who got close to the West.
And you start to see a pattern.
And Fred's M.O.,
Picking up young women who are vulnerable,
hitchhiking or away from home.
like Juanita Mott.
Yeah, she vanished while hitchhiking to Gloucester.
Her family thought she'd run away,
Right.
not realizing she was buried under their noses.
At 25 Cromwell Street.
Chilling reminder that these predators,
They're often hiding in plain sight.
taking advantage of vulnerability.
Yeah, societal norms.
Speaking of societal norms,
Yeah.
the podcast talked about how the West case,
Forced changes in procedures.
like how seriously missing persons reports are taken.
Especially for young women.
Absolutely.
The West case exposed a huge blind spot.
In the system,
Yeah, this tendency to just dismiss certain cases.
as runaways are unimportant.
Exactly. But those changes came at a terrible cost.
Yeah.
The podcast details the violence Juanita endured,
The rope found with her remains,
the skull fracture,
indicating blunt force trauma.
probably a hammer.
Her death was not quick or painless.
No, it wasn't. And what's really unsettling...
Is that even with all the evidence?
Yeah,
There are still gaps.
missing details.
Like the victim Fred called the second Worcester girl
Right, they never found her.
in the cellar.
And then there's the fact that all the victims,
We're missing smaller bones.
kneecaps,
Timbers.
toes,
That always gets me.
it's like a final act of dehumanization,
Erasing their individuality.
even in death.
It leads us to one of the most disturbing parts of the case.
Fred's confession note.
He mentions two victims not found at Cromwell Street,
His first wife, Rena.
and her friend Anna McFall.
Right. And the podcast takes us to Fred's childhood haunts.
Expanding the scope of this nightmare
It really does. We go from Cromwell Street
to these rural fields
to Letterbox Field
where Fred claimed to have buried Rena,
and Fingerpost Field.
where they eventually found Anna McFall.
The shift in setting.
It just adds to the unease.
That's like the darkness.
Isn't it limited to one place?
It's seeped into the landscape.
And then there's Charmaine.
Rena's daughter.
Fred said he killed her.
And buried her under their old home.
At 25 Midland Road.
And like the others.
Charmaine was missing those smaller bones, too.
It's a chilling consistency.
A macabre signature.
The podcast explores the theory
that Fred kept those bones as trophies.
Souvenirs of his crimes.
It's a truly disturbing thought.
Makes you wonder about the nature of evil.
The why behind these horrific acts.
And then you have Fred's conflicting stories.
1 minute, he killed Rena in a rage.
The next, it was an accident.
How do you separate fact from fiction?
With a character like Fred.
That's the challenge with this whole case.
Fred was a liar.
A master manipulator.
He used Rose as a shield.
Claiming he killed to protect her.
To eliminate threats.
But he also insisted she knew nothing.
About the murders.
And that's where the inconsistencies start to pile up.
The podcast highlights Rose's knowledge of Fred's joke.
About Heather being buried under the patio. Her history of restraining her own children.
Her presence when Fred picked up young women.
Was she really oblivious?
Or was she complicit?
The podcast presents evidence.
That she might have been more involved.
The witnesses claim to have seen Rose with some of the victims.
Others allege she participated in the abuse.
That she enjoyed inflicting pain.
And control.
It's a stark contrast.
To the image she tried to project.
The innocent victim.
Of a controlling husband.
But as the podcast lays out the evidence,
that narrative falls apart.
We hear from Catherine Holliday and Miss A.
Both describing terrifying experiences with Rose.
Painting a picture of a woman
who not only knew,
but actively participated.
It's a chilling reminder.
That evil wears many faces.
And sometimes the most monstrous acts
are committed by those we least suspect.
So we've looked at the victims' stories.
The evidence suggesting Rose's involvement.
The inconsistencies in Fred's accounts.
That's a lot to process.
And it leaves us with more questions than answers.
But the story doesn't end here.
No, it doesn't.
Next time, we'll explore the trial, the shocking testimony.
And the questions that remain.
Even after the verdicts are delivered. Okay, so we spent the last 2 parts really digging into this horrific case of Fred and Rose West.
Yeah.
From those initial discoveries at 25 Cromwell Street to the individual stories of their victims. But with Fred's suicide before the trial, the focus really shifts to Rose and the question of how to prove her involvement.
Legally, it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because without Fred's testimony...
Which was always unreliable anyway.
They had to build a case against Rose based mostly on circumstantial evidence.
Right.
So they had to connect all these dots.
Between her actions, the witness accounts, and the patterns of abuse.
Yeah. And all while meeting this really high burden of proof.
Right, for a criminal conviction.
There's a huge challenge.
And the podcast really emphasizes that.
They do.
It's not enough to just say, oh, she was married to a serial killer, so she must be guilty.
No.
They had to actually demonstrate her participation.
Her knowledge of the crimes and her intent.
Exactly. And all of that played out very publicly.
In a trial that captivated the nation.
It really did.
The trial itself becomes like this whole other chapter in this story.
Yeah.
The podcast does a good job of capturing that media frenzy.
The pressure on these witnesses.
Yeah, to relive this trauma in front of the whole world.
And it must have been so difficult to find an impartial jury.
With a case this notorious.
It's true. You can practically feel the tension in the courtroom as this trial unfolds.
Oh, I can imagine.
Each witness taking the stand.
Adding another piece to the puzzle.
And some of the most powerful moments come from those who actually survived the West's abuse.
Like Carolyn Owens.
Yeah, the one that got away.
Her testimony is just gut-wrenching.
It is. The podcast talks about how she felt this responsibility to speak out.
Not just for herself.
Right, but for those who couldn't.
It's incredibly brave of her.
It really is.
And it also highlights how long-lasting the effects of trauma can be.
It's a reminder that surviving is just the beginning.
Yeah. Then you have Catherine Holliday and Miss A.
Right.
Sharing their own terrifying encounters with Rose.
Further challenging this image of her as a bystander.
These weren't just vague accusations.
No, they were specific instances of violence and sadism.
Right? Their testimony directly contradicts Rose's claims.
That she didn't know anything.
And it starts to dismantle the defense's argument.
That she was just a victim of Fred.
And then we have the testimony of Anna Marie West.
Fred and Rose's daughter.
Hearing her account of the abuse she suffered.
Is just incredibly difficult.
She talks about the rapes.
And Fred getting her pregnant when she was only 15.
It's heartbreaking. It really underscores the damage that was inflicted within that house.
The ripple effects of abuse.
That go so far beyond the immediate victims.
And the podcast doesn't just use her testimony for shock value.
No. They talk about her anxiety, her suicide attempt.
The immense courage it took for her to even come forward.
They humanize her.
Remind us that she's more than just a witness in this awful case.
And then there's Janet Leach, the social worker.
Who had those confidential conversations with Fred.
Her testimony becomes crucial.
Because she reveals things Fred told her.
That contradict his claims about Rose.
It's like a legal thriller.
It really is. Janet's bound by confidentiality.
But she also knows what she heard could impact the trial.
And then, tragically, she suffers a stroke.
Likely brought on by all this stress.
It's another reminder of the toll this case took.
On everyone involved.
The weight of the secrets and the fight for justice.
Even though Janet had that stroke, her notes from the conversations were admissible.
Right.
And they really cast a shadow over Rose's defense.
They do. And the most shocking revelation from those notes
is that Fred admitted to more victims.
Secrets he took to his grave.
It really leaves you with this unsettling feeling.
Yeah, that we may never know the full extent of it.
So with all this evidence against Rose, how did her defense try to counter it?
Well, they tried to stick with the story of Rose as a victim.
A woman controlled by an abusive husband?
Right. They pointed out that she had also suffered abuse at Fred's hands.
That she was trapped in this cycle of violence.
But the podcast picks apart that defense pretty effectively.
They highlight Rose's own words, her letters to Fred in prison.
Right.
Letters that suggest she accepted and maybe even enjoyed the abuse.
And then Rose makes a bold move.
She decides to take the stand herself.
It was a risky gamble.
It was. The podcast really brings those moments in the courtroom to life.
You can hear her carefully crafted answers.
Her attempts to deflect blame.
Her emotional outbursts.
It becomes this psychological battle.
The jury is trying to figure out
if she's a manipulator.
Or a terrified woman caught in her own web.
And in the end, her testimony seems to backfire.
The jury finds her guilty on all 10 counts of murder.
And Rose West is sentenced to life in prison.
Without the possibility of parole.
It's a moment of legal closure, I guess.
A sense that justice was served.
But it doesn't erase the pain or bring back the victims.
No, it doesn't. And the podcast doesn't end with a verdict either.
They talk about the demolition of 25 Cromwell Street.
This decision to erase this physical reminder of the horrors.
But can you really erase the past?
It's a good question. Can you truly demolish the memories and the trauma?
It's complicated. The podcast also briefly mentions the surviving West children.
Trying to rebuild their lives and process everything they went through.
Some of them have written memoirs about it.
Sharing their stories and their journey toward healing.
It's a reminder that even amidst all this darkness,
there can be resilience and a path towards recovery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the case of Fred and Rose West, we're left with a lot to think about.
We are. It's a case that forces us to confront the darkest parts of humanity.
The complexities of family and the power of secrets.
It also makes us think about our justice system.
The challenges of proving guilt and that constant search for closure.
It definitely left me with a lot to process.
Me too. Those victims' stories will stay with me.
And the unsettling realization that monsters can be hiding anywhere.
What are your takeaways from all of this?
Yeah, what will you carry with you from this exploration of cruelty and justice?